Thank you for joining us this week for our discussion panel talking about visualizations. I'm joined here today by our lead educator on the course, Professor Ian Haynes, whom you'll be familiar with. We're also joined by Bill Griffiths, who works for Tyne Archives and Museums, is the head of programs, but through his career in Tyne has been significantly involved in all the activities at Arbea, Roman Fort, and South Shields, and also, let's not forget, Sacagdunum Fort at Wall's End, and has excellent experience of visualizations and particularly reconstruction. So we're going to start off our question with one raised by both Robert Morrill and Margaret Washington, who ask, how can we be sure that visualizations are historically accurate? A corollary to this question, actually, a good second part is added by Elizabeth Fowler, who asks, once the visualization is completed, is there any sort of review process that academics, scholars, and other experts will get involved in to make sure that those details are accurate? So we'll start this question with Ian, but also I'm sure Bill will have some experience and advice and expertise to add on this as well. So Ian?
Thank you. Well, those are great questions, actually. And I think one of the points to note is that we often can't be absolutely sure that things were historically accurate, which raises a series of questions. First of all, we've already presented a series of different types of visualization. So we've shown cases where we have people in costume settings, and they're questions of costume, they're questions about structural visualizations, talking about visualizing landscapes. So there are multiple different levels, and there are also many different methods that we can use. So in some cases, it's people literally recreating in the real world objects, items of dress, structures. In some cases, visualization is wholly achieved through digital mechanisms. And those different media have different implications, really, for what you can do, what you can attempt, and also how you can address there Elizabeth Fowler's question in terms of how you can make evident and transparent the degrees of certainty with which you can work. So we set ourselves a fairly challenging test in this course of visualizing some scenes as they might have appeared in the 4th century. And one of the things that might strike us there is some types of evidence that we have for daily activity in the 4th century are better attested than they are for earlier periods and for different parts of the empire. But some of them are actually much less well represented. So you're getting different types of source material playing in for different types of activity. And that means that we need to be quite explicit amongst ourselves as to how we arrive at the visualizations we settle on. Now, herein is a big opportunity with visualization. We have for this brought together experts in structures and small finds, in artistic representation, in the literary sources, to give what we think are the most convincing, affordable, most plausible visualizations that we can manage to achieve. But with visualizations, there is often a sort of hierarchy in terms of levels of conviction. We can, for example, have a single small find that we know was used at a particular moment in time, and we can go from that to a museum quality reproduction relatively easily. Bigger accoutrements or an assemblage of activities can present other problems. Now, to address this problem, primarily it must be said through the increasing number of almost photorealistic digital visualizations that were emerging on the market. Something called the London Charter, almost 10 years old now, was arranged between colleagues who were working in the field of visualization. And what they said is visualizations can be so powerfully seductive, they can appear to be so compelling that people instantly believe all of them, that it was necessary to make quite explicit where the source material was coming from for them and the degrees of conviction with which the visualizers were operating. So you go from, if you like, yes, we're absolutely certain about this, we've excavated this at this spot, we can see it's from this time, we can actually restore it to its original appearance with quite 100% conviction, through to following on from that, we think that this was probably happening. Following on to, given analogies at various other places, this is actually quite a likely thing that's happening, through to this might structurally fit or fit within the context, through to advanced kite flying in a way, where you're left with a good guess based on a sort of consensus of experience. And that's very useful. So if we go to Elizabeth Fowler's question there as well, one of the great things is that this then becomes a resource. The notes that go into the creative process, the observations of different experts, the types of sources are then all itemised. And this becomes, in essence, a piece of research. And a piece of research that's been generated by a team of experts who are provoked to ask that question, how much can we really say afresh again and again, as they try to scale new heights of visualisation. So there is now that vehicle through the London Charter of making explicit what we know, what we think is happening, and also where we're frankly still in the dark, and that flags up areas for future work in the future.
But surely that's an ideal. So what about when it comes into practice and practical aspects? Elizabeth Fowler also asks, is that too expensive to involve those experts?
Well, I think, if I may, I think it really depends on the project, the amount of budget behind it. But one very practical example was the reconstruction of the southwest gateway at Arbea Roman fort. Hugely contentious in the 1980s when it was done. A lot of people very concerned it would fossilise a view and understanding of a Roman fort gateway. Because exactly as the London Charter set against that fear, that becomes the only way you can visualise the reconstruction. Now, with that one, we held a significant archaeological conference beforehand, exploring all sorts of different aspects of Roman gateways. In the interpretation of the gateway, we were very, very clear about where the evidence came from. Effectively, go back to school, show your workings out, which again the London Charter reflects on. So very much it was about demonstrating the workings out. That's all published in a British Archaeological Reports volume about the gateway. So you can do it at that kind of level and really, really, I think, set quite a benchmark for academic research around the subject of Roman gateways. But it does depend so much on the budget, it depends on what you're reconstructing. So the bathhouse at Segedunum is based on the bathhouse at Chester's, of which we have substantially complete ground plan. The conjecture is all in the roof space. So it's bringing out that interpretation, but you didn't have the same level of conference required behind it because we understood the broad structure of the building quite well. So I think the more there is variety and uncertainty about interpretation, the more important it is to bring in as many different views as possible.
And if I may, I think Bill has rightly stressed that excellent work at the gate at Arbea. But even before that, we were seeing a lot of often very popular reconstruction artists producing images in pen and ink, which also had a very powerful impact. So it doesn't necessarily have to be on that magnificent scale before it starts to influence the way people are thinking and picturing the past for themselves. One thinks of classic artists like Ronald Embleton, Alan Sorrell. They influenced generations in their thinking, and there was some great work behind there. But the recent development is this idea about colleagues working together and explaining how they're going through the process. And that actually turns these from a challenge to face through to a provocation to further research. It creates new research communities and actually forces people to flush out the things that they hadn't really thought about, but they realise they need to address.
To some extent, that also actually leads in quite nicely to some of Jason Hunt's observations and questions. Jason, I'm going to modify your question slightly, but you start with the observation that visualizations in especially physical reconstructions in the UK are not quite as popular as they are in other European countries, and Germany and Sweden and Norway. Specifically, Jason wants to know how academia can promote visualization. But also there's a question, I think more broadly to both of you, that how do we make sure that visualization isn't just an excuse to play dress up, or that it's not perceived by those who wield the purse strings and create policy, that it's not people playing dress up. How is it more than what it's called cosplay, is it?
I mean, there are, I think, at the last count, 11 open-air archaeological museums in the UK, which is relatively small number, set against that European background, and some of them are really relatively small. I mean, Arbea and Segedunum both count as two of those 11. I think, though, in terms of thinking about the role of academia, it's going back to the point of showing the workings out. and demonstrating the work you're doing has a research base. It's not simply for show. So you need to demonstrate, say if it's a reenactment group, the research behind the making of the kit. It's not simply a copying of a picture. There's actually research on the materials, looking at different archaeological artifacts and so on. And I think academia has a role to play in actually getting behind and validating some of that very practical work that a lot of the reenactors are doing to make kit, and actually partnering up more with reenactors and ensuring that the kit is as accurate as it can be in terms of materials, in terms of construction techniques, etc. But on conversely, I think a lot of the reenactors need to think about that wider research value of the work they're doing, really, so their costume can be as accurate as possible, and they need to engage more with the academic community. So I think it's a two-way street, really.
I totally agree. I mean, one of the marvellous things about being an archaeologist is it's not just a bunch of academics in ivory towers. There are so many people doing different types of archaeology out there who form expert bodies of knowledge, and what we want is to have our collective expertise working. So that point about dialogue is really, really important. And the truth is, it is actually harder sometimes to address relatively simple questions, like if you had walked into a Romano-British farmstead at dinner time, whenever that was, what would actually you have seen? Who might have been sitting where? How were the furnishings? What would have been arranged? What would have been on the table at the same time? Would a table have been being in use? Who would have been present? These are all sorts of questions which were absolutely of fundamental importance to the people living them at the time, which actually far from straightforward for us to encounter. So it's all linked to research, and therefore academia should be interested in it. And it's not a question that is should be shunted to one side or seen as a sort of a dressing up or play activity. But there's another point here. If you go to Albea, which I would urge you to do if you haven't done, if you go to Segaduna, which I'd urge you to do if you haven't done, those sites are magnificently set out. But if you encountered them for the first time without those visualisations, well, the chances are, in one or two cases, you might come away finding it very difficult to read the sites. I might be very happy wandering over a number of sort of restored foundation walls at ankle height, but it's fair to say that the vast majority of the public want something more. And I think that once they actually engage with these visualisations, they're engaging very actively with the product of research, they're engaging with the impact of research, but that then helps equip their eyes to go back and look at the material. And that's something that's in everybody's interest. It's in academia's interest, and it's in the heritage sector's interest. So these things are essential, and sites that are not engaging with them actually suffer. And they suffer in a number of ways. They suffer in the experience they give to visitors, and sometimes they suffer from a communication point of view too.
Very interesting, slightly apocryphal story, but when I started Albea, school groups would ask whether the Romans were really small because the walls were only 2 or 3 feet high at best. They don't ask that anymore because we built the gateway. They can actually get a sense of the proper scale. And before I came to Albea, I was teaching O-level archaeology back in the day, and we'll put up visualizations of Roman gateways, drawings by some of the great artists like Peter Connolly, people like that, and everyone will just accept them. Whenever I've taken a group around the gateway, the reconstruction, the full-scale reconstruction, I always get challenged on different parts of it. There's something about doing it in that 3D scale that really, really gets people's brains fired up, because they start questioning, do we really believe this? Could this possibly be right? Can it really be that high? In a way, you don't question a drawing, you just accept the drawing for what it is my experience. So I think those kind of full-scale reconstructions have a real role to play in engaging people in those first steps in that academic thought process of how do we really know this is right.
Thank you. Sticking within that vein, though, of the actual reconstructions, Richard Ackes asks how you come to the decision to reconstruct the buildings, particularly at South Shields, on the actual footprint of those archaeological remains. Should those remains be left open and available for future generations to explore, rather than covering them or making them inaccessible by reconstruction?
That's a really important question, and it's something that you should never think about lightly. I mean, I would say it's a case-by-case basis, depending, because we've done both at different times. To explain the gateway, for example, at Albea and the other reconstructions, they're on the actual footprints of the original buildings on which they are based. The gateway, the foundations of the original gateway are preserved beneath the concrete raft, and the reconstruction is on top of that. If ever wanted to, we could take away the reconstruction gateway and show the original remains. They're still preserved. However, they're not very visually exciting, and we've got a couple of other gateways on the site that you can go and look at, which are actually better preserved. And the other challenge for our Bayer is if we didn't put the gateway on the site of the gateway, we'd have to put it on top of some other piece of archaeology, and I think that's really, really misleading. So on that occasion, I would say that the interpretation of the site and that desire to engage people with the history of the site is best served by having that reconstruction on top of the remains, not least because there are other gateways you can look at. In the case of the courtyard building and the barrack block, the archaeology has been completely removed in the process of excavation, so there are no, you'll be putting back either the stones in the same order or building the reconstruction. So either way, it's not really the original. However, at Segedunum, we've reconstructed a section of Hadrian's Wall. We had the foundations of Hadrian's Wall. We've laid those out. We cleared what little archaeology there was to the south of it and put the reconstruction on that site so people can compare what we think the wall looked like with what we actually know. And I think that's a very valid technique as well. So I think it does depend. I don't think there's always one answer. What you should always do is ensure that any archaeology is fully recorded. And that really, I think, is the key. Not just as a good practice, but also in terms of that research element of your reconstruction, of ensuring it is as accurate as it can be based on the evidence that you have.
Thank you. I'm going to move us to a slightly different question now. Gordon Henderson asks, if evidence indicates that the site evolved and changed several times, what process do you go through to choose the period which will be visualized? It's an excellent question because, as you'll have discovered through the course, or maybe you previously, archaeology is that complex series of layers. And when you have a very complex site with multiple phases of occupation, it's knowing which layer you really need to focus on for consolidation, for display, for interpretation. So we'll start with Bill in terms of the practical, but also there's merit here intellectually and academically in this choice too.
I mean, obviously this is about the physical laying out of the site, and the site is a palimpsest. There are all these different layers of different periods, and sometimes not even just Roman. So do you take the site back to one period and display that site physically? I say physically because you can always display all the different phases in the guidebook or in a computer-generated reconstruction, such we've done at Segedunum. But what do you do with the physical remains? And again, it's horses for courses. I think you need to look at which remains visually tell their own story as much as is possible. And you probably have to try and achieve a balance across the different periods without confusing the story of the site too much. Now that sounds like trying to sort of step away from discussing the detail. If you've got a fort, you've got your boundary walls, that's relatively straightforward. But then as buildings change and shift through time, you cannot always display all of them. So in the end, you really do have to think about what will have the most meaning for the visitor. And as Ian was saying earlier, there's that point about the reconstructions bringing the sites that are Bayer and Segedunum to life. It's a real struggle otherwise, because in some parts you've almost got sort of two buildings on top of each other. One part of one building is more interesting, one part of another building is more interesting. Where do you tip the balance in terms of laying it out? And I think it really has to go back down to the ability of the remains to speak for themselves to an extent with limited interpretation.
I think there is a counterpart to this very interesting question, which is also you find in archaeological fieldwork, and throughout the history of archaeology, you've had people who've sort of thought, I want to get to such and such a layer. And this has actually bedeviled us in multiple cases in excavation. Rob, as a specialist who's worked a lot on late Roman sites, will bear witness to the number of people who've been sort of seeking to get down to a golden age, which, for whatever agenda is perceived as perhaps the moment Hadrian's Wall was first designed, for example. And things got, in early, perhaps antiquarian works, other later things were lost. I think Bill has offers an extremely convincing explanation of how you go about solving this problem when you're presenting sites. And I think one of the marvellous ways that has actually come out in Tyne properties is that actually if you visit them, you're not just presented with a sense of what things might have been or what everything looked like in the reign of Hadrian. You can actually go into, as we have done on the visualisation, a 4th century house, for example. And I think that gives people a sense of time depth, which is very important. But the other part of this is, of course, again, bringing in the digital technologies. And there are a lot of 4D visualizations, the 4th dimension, of course, being time, that have been used very effectively. In week 6 of the online course, for example, we feature a pioneering 4D visualization that was generated for Segedunum. So you can, in those situations, actually have the benefit of seeing a site evolving digitally. Which allows us to avoid the challenge of building it physically in 3 dimensions and having to plump for one phase or another. So I think the digital liberates us in certain ways as well.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because Yahao Yo, and my apologies if I mispronounced the name, asks if you foresee 3D visualizations, digital 3D visualizations, getting to the stage where you can walk through the experience, moving through the bathhouse digitally rather than having to visit Segedunum itself, which obviously still should be done.
Yes.
In other rooms.
Yeah. I think now what we are seeing, actually, I mean, first of all, I'd say you already have the technology to do that, and it's happening in a number of places. There are a range of different wearable devices that people are using. There are a range of devices that may be smartphone enabled as well. So you've got GPS, you've got the coordinates as you move through the space. Your view of the site is actually transformed by looking at a visualization, and you can move around that. We're seeing new forms of head encasing devices, different forms of glasses almost that will allow this sort of thing to happen as well. So there are all sorts of wearable devices that we're now looking at that we can move around. We've also got an intersection here between all of the research, the heritage presentation needs, and gamification. So games technologies, games platforms, and those are moving forward at a great pace. And the exciting thing about this is that these are hand in hand now, often. And that gamification should not be construed as dumbing down. Gamification is something that actually allows some of the most rapidly moving technologies to actually engage with some really rapidly moving ideas in archaeology and archaeological visualization to make it a dynamic experience. And the opportunities are enormous now with that. So we're seeing that happening. And this also brings us back to something that we're all working on here, and which we'll be asking for your help with, actually, next week, because one of the links that we'll be offering is to our Experiencing Hadrian's Wall app, which allows you to navigate around a visualized section of Hadrian's Wall based on the Newcastle area, and which also uses a number of tricks that we've introduced, which we hope add to its educational value. So you can actually switch between or toggle between different potential visualizations of the same feature, a way of actually evaluating perhaps which one might consider plausible, and move between information panels and actually a landscape view that you can navigate through. So what we'd like to do is very strongly encourage you, please, to actually have a look at this when it comes on next week and give us feedback, which we will in turn feed into the next stage of development of the model. So if you've got the time and the inclination, this is a great way for you to help very directly as we move forward through these new technologies.
Well, thank you very much, Phil. Thank you very much, Ian.
Thank you, Rob.
I think we'll leave it there. So it's a nice short video. It doesn't take too long in your day. Thank you, everyone who submitted questions. We used the like option to try and filter out the most kind of popular questions, as it were, and also select those questions which were most oft repeated. Some of you had questions that were very specific to our 4th century visualization, and we'll address those on the platform more directly where we can. But thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to seeing you back in the MOOC.
Thank you.
Thank you.